man was found half buried in the snow, his shirt soaked in blood, his gun beside him, breath faint as a whisper. The whole town kept their doors shut, but one woman, a poor widow, opened hers. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't know he carried a past filled with darkness and pain. She only saw a life worth saving. That night, in a cold cabin lit by a dying fire, she sparked the last ember of kindness. And fate quietly began to turn, because sometimes one act of mercy can change two lives, one who had lost faith, and one who still believed that goodness never fades. If you believe that too, this story is for you. Tell me, where are you watching from? Share your city in the comments. And if these stories warm your heart, don't forget to subscribe to join us on the next one. May your evening be peaceful, and may kindness keep its quiet flame in you tonight. They said the winter of '75 came down like judgment, merciless, white and heavy as penance itself. Out on the far edge of Juniper Hollow, where the land broke into long breaths of frozen field, the wind carried a sound that didn't belong to the living. The sky had the color of pewter, and the snow moved sideways, slashing through the pines like shards of glass. Even the river had turned still, sealed under a sheet of ice so thick it silenced the world. And in that silence, the last spark of warmth flickered in a lonely cabin that seemed far too small to withstand such a season. Inside, Sarah Holloway stood by the frost-blurred window, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee gone cold. The firewood stack was down to 3 logs, maybe enough for one more night. Her breath fogged the glass as she looked out into the storm, and for a moment, the reflection staring back at her seemed like a stranger, a 32-year-old woman with tired eyes, cheeks hollowed by hunger, auburn hair tucked under a wool scarf too thin for the cold. Behind her, 2 children slept close together under a patched quilt, the faint rise and fall of their chests the only rhythm left in the room. The boy, Thomas, was 8 small for his age, sharp as flint, but gentle as the snow falling outside. His sister Emma, 10, had her mother's eyes and a courage that showed even in sleep. Sarah watched them for a long time, letting that fragile peace fill the cabin before turning back to the window. There was something in the air that night, a heaviness that pressed down on her ribs like an omen. Then came one single hollow knock. At first, she thought it was the wind, maybe a branch breaking loose, but it came again, deliberate, weighted, human. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor. For a heartbeat, she froze. No one traveled these hills in a storm like this. No one is sane, at least. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped toward the door. The sound came once more, softer now, as if whoever stood outside was losing strength. Sarah reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, the cold already seeping through the wood. When she opened the door, the storm roared in snow whipping, light dying, the fire behind her nearly snuffed out, and in its fury stood a man. He was tall, maybe late 30s, with the rugged frame of someone who'd known hard labor, though life was draining fast from him. His face was as pale as the snow around him, save for the blood blooming through his shirt like some terrible red flower. He staggered forward, eyes glassy, lips blue, and fell at her feet before a single word could leave his mouth. Sarah dropped to her knees. "Dear Lord." Her voice was barely a whisper, lost to the wind. She pressed her hands against his chest. The blood was warm against her cold fingers. "Thomas," she called. "Emma, fetch me the blanket quickly." The children scrambled from the bed, fear wide in their eyes, but obedience stronger. Together they dragged the stranger inside, closing the door against the gale. The firelight trembled over his face, rough features weathered by sun and dust, stubble thick across a strong jaw, and lashes crusted with ice. He was no outlaw, she decided. His hands were calloused like a worker's, not cruel like a killer's. Still, the gun holster at his side made her heart thud harder. Sarah stripped off his soaked coat, revealing a bullet wound high on his shoulder. Blood had frozen along the seam of his shirt. "He's been shot," she murmured, more to herself than to the children. "We don't have medicine, Mama," Emma whispered. "I know." Sarah's voice was steady now, though her hands were not. "But we've got faith, and that'll have to do." They cleaned him with snow melt, pressed an old cloth against the wound, and wrapped him in the only spare blanket they owned. The stranger groaned, his head turning side to side. Words slipped from his lips, tangled in fever. Margaret, the papers. Double H must survive. Sarah frowned. The names meant nothing, but his tone, that desperate pleading, wasn't the sound of a man begging for his own life. It was something else, something heavier. By midnight, his fever broke into shivers. Sarah sat beside him, wiping his brow with a damp rag, whispering prayers she half remembered from her mother. The children had long since fallen asleep again, curled near the hearth, the flickering fire painting their faces in gold and shadow. For the first time in weeks, the cabin felt alive, not peaceful, but alive. A stranger's breathing filled the space between her thoughts. The wind outside had eased, replaced by a softer rhythm, like the world itself was listening. She studied him in the wavering light, the faint lines around his eyes, the scar across his jaw, the way his hands twitched as if still gripping something. Whoever he was, life hadn't been kind to him. But then again, neither had it been kind to her. She thought of her husband Henry, gone 2 winters now, buried on the ridge where the first light touched. He'd left behind debts, drought, and a heart that learned how to ache quietly. Since then, Sarah had known how to keep moving one sunrise at a time, one meal less each week. But this man, this bleeding stranger, he was a reminder that even broken things still fought to live. Just before dawn, a faint glow rose over the horizon, blurring the edges of snow and sky. The storm had quieted to a whisper. Inside, Sarah's candle burned low, the wax pooling like tears. The man stirred, muttering again, the name Margaret, catching on his breath. She reached for his hand, half from instinct, half from pity. His skin was burning, and yet beneath it she could feel the faintest pulse, a small stubborn rhythm refusing to give up. She closed her eyes, whispering into the quiet, "You hold on now, whoever you are." The morning came gray and slow. Smoke from the chimney curled into the still air, fragile as a promise. Snow dripped from the eaves in soft, steady beats. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something unfamiliar move in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but the faint stirring of it. Outside, the world remained silent, blanketed in white. But just beyond the tree line, unseen through the fog and snow, 3 riders waited in dark shapes against the pale morning. Their horses pawed at the ice. One of the men raised a gloved hand and pointed toward the faint flicker of light from Sarah Holloway's cabin, and as the smoke drifted upward, they began to move. At dawn, the riders vanished into the mist as quietly as they had come, leaving only hoofprints pressed deep into the snow. The storm had broken at last, but its silence felt no kinder, heavy, watchful, almost listening. Smoke rose thinly from the cabin's chimney, curling into the gray morning like a fragile thread between 2 worlds, one that struggled to survive and one that hunted. Inside, Sarah moved quietly, feeding the last scraps of wood into the fire. The man on her cot was breathing, barely his body pale as the linen she'd torn to bind his wounds. 3 nights had passed since he collapsed at her door, yet the memory of those distant riders haunted every crack of the window pane. She could feel danger still circling, just beyond the line of the trees. By the 3rd morning, the storm had loosened its grip, leaving the valley glazed in quiet white. The snow glittered beneath a pale sun, and icicles hung from the eaves like frozen prayers. Inside the cabin, the air was still heavy with the scent of smoke, boiled oats, and something else. The slow rhythm of breath returning to a man who had nearly lost it. Sarah sat by the fire, darning a sock by hand, her movements slow and methodical, more from habit than hope. The stranger's fever had broken hours ago, but she hadn't dared to believe it until his eyes fluttered open. They were the kind of blue that belonged to open skies after a storm, piercing, sharp, and too alive for someone who had walked so close to death. He blinked, disoriented, then found her face in the blur of firelight. His lips parted, voice rough and unpolished. "James," he said, the name landing heavy in the quiet. "James Holleran." Sarah set her needle aside, her heart quickening. "You remember your name at least," she murmured. He tried to sit up, grimacing, one hand clutching his shoulder. As he moved, the faint smell of leather, gunpowder, and something finer than a trace of expensive tobacco maybe drifted into the room. It was a smell Sarah hadn't known in years, not since her husband's days working the big ranches out west. It carried the ghost of money, the kind that came with trouble. "I owe you my life, ma'am," James said quietly. His voice had the weight of gravel and regret. "But you may regret saving me." Sarah met his eyes, calm but unyielding. "I don't regret helping anyone who knocks at my door." For a long moment, the two simply looked at each other, the wary calm of two souls who had both lost too much. Then she rose, stirred the fire, and said softly, "Rest. You're not ready to be anywhere else yet." That night, the wind returned, howling through the cracks in the walls like a warning. James sat by the hearth, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of pine smoke. His face was gaunt but strong, the kind carved by long years in the saddle. He told stories between cough fragments about a ranch somewhere west, about men who didn't forgive, debts easily, about the way the plains looked under a harvest moon. But every story felt unfinished, each one cut short before it reached the truth. Sarah listened, her expression unreadable. She wanted to ask who had shot him, or why the name Double H had fallen from his lips in fevered sleep. But she knew better than to push a man who wasn't ready to tell. The West had its own way of keeping secrets, and some of them had teeth. The children sat nearby, eyes wide, watching him as if he were a legend come to life. Thomas asked shyly, "Mr. James, you ever seen a buffalo up close?" James smiled faintly, a crease forming beneath the stubble. "Seen one, chased one, and nearly got myself trampled by one." Thomas grinned. Emma giggled, covering her mouth. For a few fleeting minutes, the cabin sounded like a home again. But outside, the wind carried a different kind of sound, the distant rhythm of hooves, faint and deliberate. By the following evening, Sarah felt the unease growing like frost beneath her ribs. She stepped outside before dusk, scanning the horizon. The world was hushed, heavy, the kind of silence that came before a storm or a reckoning. When night fell, the sound came again. Hoofbeats, steady and certain, cutting across the frozen ground. Sarah's hand went to the lamp, and she blew it out, plunging the room into darkness. "Stay quiet," she whispered. The children obeyed, huddled near the hearth, eyes wide in the dim glow of the dying coals. The knock on the door came hard and sharp. 3 silhouettes loomed beyond the windowmen on horseback, breath steaming in the cold. The tallest dismounted first, boots crunching on the ice. His voice was calm, almost polite. "Evening, ma'am. We're looking for someone. A cowboy. Wounded. Might have come this way." Sarah's pulse quickened, but her voice stayed even. "You'll find no one here but me and my children," she said. Another man leaned forward, his smile thin as a knife. "You sure about that? Tracks led straight through here." Sarah met his gaze, eyes as cold as the snow. "Only ghosts pass through these parts." A long pause followed, the kind where danger breathes but doesn't speak. Then the leader gave a faint nod. "Ghosts, huh? Well, if you see any living ones, you let us know." He turned, swung up onto his horse, and the 3 rode off, their shadows disappearing into the gray night. Inside, Sarah's knees trembled, but she didn't let it show. She relit the lamp, the flame flickering weakly against the walls. The children exhaled as one, relief softening their faces. James hadn't moved the entire time. He sat half in shadow, jaw tight, eyes burning with something unspoken. Finally, he said, "You lied for me." Sarah set the lamp on the table, her voice steady. "And you haven't told me why I needed to." The silence stretched. The fire popped. Then James reached slowly into his coat, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested. From an inside pocket, he drew a folded piece of parchment, edges worn, stained faintly with blood. He looked at her then not as a stranger, but as someone who knew the weight of the truth. "Because that lie," he said softly, unfolding the document, "may have just saved a fortune. And your life." The firelight caught the glint of something on the page, a seal broken, the faint imprint of an old ranch brand, Double H. Outside, the wind began to rise again. The thaw came late that year. It didn't arrive in triumph, only in quiet persistence, a slow surrender of the frost, a long sigh from the land that had endured too much. The river cracked first, spilling its laughter into the valleys again. Then the snow retreated in ribbons, revealing black soil beneath, like the earth itself was taking its first breath after a long sleep. Around the Holloway cabin, patches of green dared to show. Smoke rose from the chimney in thinner curls now, not from desperation, but routine. And though spring had softened the world outside, the air between Sarah and James remained uncertain, a silence filled with unspoken gratitude and questions neither dared to name. James had healed enough to work again. Each morning, he went out to mend the fence that the winter storms had nearly claimed. The rhythm of hammer and nail became part of the landscape, steady, patient, deliberate. When he worked, he wore an old brown hat pulled low over his brow. His shirt sleeves rolled, the scars on his forearms catching the sunlight like faint silver. Sometimes Sarah watched from the window, a quiet weight in her chest that she couldn't quite name. In the evenings, when the wind mellowed and the world glowed gold, James sat at the table with scraps of paper, drawing lines, tracing curves, marking spots as if the land itself were whispering directions only he could hear. Blueprints, he said, though for what? He never explained. His eyes, whenever she asked, would soften just slightly and then drift away, as though the truth lived somewhere he wasn't ready to return to. The children adored him. Emma read to him from an old storybook, her voice careful and clear. He'd listen with his elbows on the table, a faint smile curling at the corner of his mouth. Sometimes, when she stumbled over a word, he'd finish it softly, not correcting, just helping. Thomas followed him everywhere, mimicking his walk, his whistle, the way he carved small things from spare wood. By the end of that week, half the windowsill was filled with tiny wooden horses, each one rough-edged but shaped with affection. Slowly, laughter returned to the cabin, the kind that didn't feel borrowed from the past, but born anew, tentative yet real. Sarah found herself smiling more often, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the rhythm of ordinary life returning after too long without its meals shared, fences mended, a table that no longer felt like an altar to loss. One evening, while the light turned amber and long shadows stretched across the floorboards, James sat at the table, unusually quiet. Sarah was washing dishes, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, when she heard the faint rustle of paper. She turned. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. The wax was dark red, pressed with a small, unfamiliar crest. "Your mortgage," he said. "Paid in full." Sarah froze, the cloth slipping from her hand. Her eyes flicked from the envelope to him, disbelief rising like heat in her face. "What are you talking about?" James leaned back slightly, his tone calm but certain. "I settled it yesterday in town." Her pride rose like a flame. "I didn't ask for your charity." He shook his head. "It's not charity." His gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. "It's a partnership." The word landed between them like something fragile and alive. Sarah frowned, unsure whether to be angry or afraid of what it meant. "Partnership?" James took a breath, then spoke as though peeling back years of silence. "I own the Double H Ranch, or what's left of it. It was an empire once. Land, horses, cattle, 100 men working the range, until the wrong partner took it from me." "Marcus Blackwood," he said, the name slowly, as if tasting iron. "He nearly killed me to finish the theft, and he would have succeeded if not for you." Sarah gripped the back of a chair. "And what is it you plan to do now?" James's eyes softened, his voice dropping low. "Start over, smaller, honest, right here in this valley. I've still got enough to build again, land, stock, and men I trust, but I need someone to build it with." Her brows furrowed. "Why me?" James didn't look away. His eyes, usually so guarded, shone with something quieter, gratitude perhaps, or longing disguised as resolve. "Because you remind me of what I lost," he said, "and what I might still deserve." The words settled into the space between them, warm and dangerous, all at once. Sarah didn't know what to say. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the faint ticking of the clock, each beat measuring the distance between fear and hope. Outside, twilight deepened, painting the land in shades of silver and blue. Emma hummed softly as she brushed Thomas's hair by the fire, the melody drifting like a memory through the air. James waited, his hands folded, patient but tense. Sarah looked at the envelope, the red seal glinting faintly in the lamplight. A promise or a trap? She couldn't tell which. Her lips parted to speak, but before a word left them, the door burst open. Thomas stumbled in, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with fear. "Mama, someone's riding fast from the ridge." The night, which had moments ago seemed calm, now pulsed with urgency. Sarah turned toward the window. Through the dim light, she saw a dark figure cutting across the hill, a rider on a black horse moving hard, snow spraying behind each stride. And as he drew closer, the moonlight caught the edge of his face, the same scarred man she'd seen once before, when death had come hunting. This time, he wasn't passing by. He was coming straight for their door. They came at dusk shadows on horseback, rifles glinting red beneath the last light of day. The air carried the metallic scent of danger, sharp and certain. From the cabin window, Sarah saw them crest the ridge like the storm had returned in human form, 6 riders, led by a man whose presence seemed to darken the very sky. Marcus Blackwood. His black coat flared in the wind, his expression calm and cruel, a man who smiled only when others bled. James was already outside. His wound was still fresh beneath the bandage, but his back was straight, his hand steady on the revolver hanging low at his side. The snow under his boots had frozen to ice, crunching like brittle glass as he stepped forward. He said nothing, only met Blackwood's stare with the kind of quiet resolve that speaks louder than any threat. Inside, Sarah's heart hammered. She pulled the children close, Thomas clinging to her skirt, Emma wide-eyed and trembling. "Under the floor," she whispered. They crawled into the narrow space beneath the boards, where the smell of dust and cold earth filled the air. She lowered the hatch and pressed her palm against it, praying they wouldn't make a sound. Outside, the silence shattered. Gunfire tore through the fading light, echoing across the valley like thunder breaking bone. The horses screamed. A window shattered above Sarah's head, and wood splinters rained down around her. She fell to her knees, clutching her cross, whispering words she hadn't spoken since Henry's death. Smoke thickened, the bitter scent of gunpowder crawling into her lungs. Then stillness. It came so suddenly, it felt unreal. No more shots, no more shouts, only the wind again, low and mournful, sweeping through the trees. Sarah rose slowly, her hands shaking, and reached for the door. The sight stopped her breath. James stood alone in the yard, hat in hand, snow swirling around him like falling ash. 3 men lay motionless near the fence. The others had vanished into the dark. His shoulder was bleeding again, the crimson soaking through his sleeve, but his eyes were steady, unbroken. "It's over," he said softly. Then, after a pause, "For tonight." He met her gaze. "But he'll come again." She stepped out, the snow crunching under her bare feet. "Then we'll be ready," she whispered. He smiled faintly, not with victory, but with recognition, as though the storm outside had found its match within her. Days passed, then weeks. The valley thawed faster this time, and the work began again. Together, they rebuilt the barn that the bullets had scarred, mended the fences, patched the holes in the roof. The sound of hammers returned, joined by laughter that felt lighter, now not free of fear, but rising in spite of it. James taught Thomas to saddle a horse properly, to clean a rifle, to read the signs of weather. He showed Emma how to tell a real promise from an empty one. And when Sarah came to him one evening, asking quietly how to shoot, he didn't question, just handed her the gun. "Hold it steady," he said, standing close behind her. "Breathe first, then squeeze." His voice was calm, guiding, the warmth of his breath brushing her ear. The shot cracked the still air, echoing off the hill. When she lowered the rifle, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange power of survival. Later, she taught him in turn, not with weapons, but with words. Each evening, before supper, she made him join their prayer. Short, quiet, sometimes awkward. He'd bow his head, eyes half closed, lips moving more out of respect than belief. But as days passed, something in his posture softened, like a man remembering a language he once spoke. Spring bloomed fully around them, the creek running clear, the willows waking, birds returning to the fences James had fixed. The world had begun again, and so had they. At twilight, as they worked side by side on the barn roof, the sky turned gold, then violet. James wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down at Sarah standing below, her hair coming loose in the breeze, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The light caught her face, and for a moment she looked almost untouched by sorrow. "You know, Sarah," he said quietly, hammer resting in his hand, "the land's not what makes a man rich." She looked up, squinting against the light, a faint smile on her lips. "Then what does?" He didn't answer, just watched her, the corners of his mouth lifting into something too tender to name. His gaze lingered longer than before, the silence between them filled with something that neither dared break. The evening faded into calm. The children were asleep early, their laughter still echoing faintly in the rafters. Sarah lingered in the doorway, the lamp burning low, her thoughts drifting like the wind outside. She climbed the stairs, exhaustion pulling at her, yet her heart strangely light. When she entered her room, the lamp on the nightstand flickered. She turned down the blanket and stopped. There, resting on her pillow, was a small wooden horse, its surface smooth from careful hands, its edges darkened where fire had brushed the wood, and on its belly, carved deep into the grain, were two letters joined by a faint burn mark, J+S. Sarah stood in silence, fingers tracing the initials. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of the wind through the shutters. Somewhere below, the fire crackled faintly steady, alive, like something that refused to die. She smiled, barely, and for the first time in years, the ache in her heart felt almost like peace. The heat arrived first thick, unbreathing, pressing down like a hand that meant to smother. Grass crisped beneath the sun, and the sky hung low, bruised with the color of waiting thunder. Sarah dozed in the quiet of afternoon, lulled by the hum of cicadas, until silence woke her, that strange, heavy kind that makes even the birds forget to sing. She sat up slowly, the hair on her arms rising. Outside, the light had turned wrong, greenish and dim, as though the world had swallowed its own breath. Beyond the fields, a dark column hung from the clouds, twisting and dipping lower with every heartbeat. A funnel, a twister, then came the shout. "Storm cellar!" James burst through the door, his face slick with sweat, eyes sharp and urgent. "Now, take the children!" But before she could move, a sound tore through the wind, the shrill, desperate scream of the horses from the barn. Thomas leapt from the floor, his small voice cracking with panic. "Papa, they'll die!" James froze for half a second, just long enough for Sarah to see the war in his eyes. Then he grabbed his hat and rifle, Storm already clawing at the porch. "Then we save them," he barked, and the door slammed open so hard it nearly flew off its hinges. Sarah didn't think. She followed. The world outside had turned wild dust spinning, wind howling, the sky a boiling cauldron of black and silver. Sheets of debris whipped past, slapping against her arms like open palms. The barn loomed ahead, trembling, its roof beginning to lift. She could hear the horses screaming inside, hooves pounding against the stalls. "Emma, go to the cellar," Sarah shouted over the wind. The girl hesitated, tears streaking her dusty face. "Now!" Sarah screamed again, and Emma ran, clutching the family Bible to her chest. Inside the barn, chaos reigned. Lightning split the sky open, flooding the world in flashes of blinding white. James was already cutting through the rope that held the gate shut, his movements quick, sure, unyielding. The animals, two mares, a chestnut stallion, and the gray filly Thomas adored, thrashed in terror, their eyes rolled white, nostrils flaring. "Open the back pen!" James shouted. "Let them out toward the low ground." Sarah stumbled through the hay and splintered wood, the storm roaring loud enough to swallow her name. Together, they heaved the latch open. One by one, the horses bolted into the storm, muscles slick with sweat, tails whipping like fire in the dark. Thomas clung to her skirt, crying out, when the youngest mare nearly fell. James caught its halter just in time, guiding it out before the wind could take it. Then came a sound like the sky itself tearing apart, a thunderclap so deep it shook the barn to its bones. The roof began to peel away. "Ropes!" James shouted. "Grab the ropes, Sarah." She found them by touching thick, coarse, fraying ends. Together, they looped them around the center beam, tying knots the way James had shown. The children weeks before. Her hands burned, her arms ached. The storm clawed at their clothes, tearing, pulling, screaming for them to give up. But they didn't. "Pull!" he yelled. She did. They braced together, her feet digging into the mud, his body straining against the weight of the storm. The beam groaned, cracked, but held. Thunder roared, hail pelted down, and for a moment the whole world was nothing but sound and fury, and two people refusing to let go. When at last the wind began to fade, Sarah could taste blood and dust on her tongue. The barn stood battered, broken, but still standing. She turned to James, breathless, her face streaked with sweat and tears and soot. His shirt was torn, his shoulder bleeding where debris had struck him, yet he was smiling faintly, the kind of smile born not of victory, but of survival. "It's done," she whispered. He nodded, eyes closing for a moment as if in prayer. For now. That night, they huddled together in the storm cellar, the air damp, smelling of earth and candle wax. The wind howled above, rattling the trap door like a beast desperate to claw its way inside. Emma sat between them, her head on Sarah's shoulder. Thomas clutched James's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sarah glanced at him, at the man who had once been a stranger bleeding on her doorstep, now sitting beside her, steady and unshaken, while the world outside tore itself apart. She reached for his hand. "You taught us to be brave," she said quietly. James turned his head, a weary smile ghosting across his face. "No," he murmured. "You already were." The wind outside raged, but inside that earthen hollow, something else took root. The kind of peace that comes after fear has done its worst. By morning, the world was a ruin of its former self. Trees lay torn from the ground, the fence twisted like rope. The sky was washed clean, pale and cold after its fury. Smoke rose faintly from the barn, but it still stood wounded, alive. James stepped into the mud, boots sinking deep. His coat was soaked, his hat gone, his face drawn but resolute. As the wind brushed past, something half buried in the dirt caught his eye. A corner of parchment, edges burned black. He bent down, lifted it gently. A letter. The wax seal half melted, but still visible the mark of Marcus Blackwood. The storm had left its signature, and it wasn't finished yet. The morning after the storm smelled of ash and promise. Smoke still curled from the far ridge, thin and gray, as if the land itself were exhaling the memory of fear. Sarah stood in the doorway, apron fluttering in the soft wind, eyes fixed on the horizon where a lone rider had once appeared out of snow, and where now another shadow began to rise. James stepped beside her, his arm still bound in a sling, jaw tight. "He's coming," he said simply. They didn't need to say his name. The air already carried Blackwood like thunder returning to a valley that had learned how to stand its ground. By dusk, fire bloomed again. The riders came with torches high, their laughter cutting through the wind, cruel and certain. Blackwood rode at the center, his coat gleaming with oil, his eyes wild with the madness of a man who'd lost everything except his hate. The flames caught the dry grass first, racing toward the fences like hungry serpents. But this time, Sarah was ready. "Get the children to the creek," she ordered, voice sharp and calm. Emma and Thomas obeyed without question, no longer frightened children, but small soldiers of the storm. James staggered after her, pain etched in his face, but purpose in every step. The fire roared across the field, orange tongues licking at the fences, devouring everything in its path. "Open the sluice gate," Sarah shouted. James hesitated for a breath. It would flood the lower field, ruin half their crop. But when he met her eyes, he saw the same fierce light that had once burned on his own. He nodded. Together they pulled the lever, the old iron creaking like the bones of the earth. Water thundered through the ditch, spilling across the furrows. The fire hissed, sputtered, and died in great steaming clouds. The land shuddered under the clash of elements, flame against flood, destruction against mercy, until the fields lay black and wet, saved by the very storm they once feared. Then came the sound of hooves, fast, hard, close. James turned, gun raised. The first shot cracked the air, echoing across the soaked pasture. The sheriff's voice followed, "Hold your fire!" And through the mist came a small posse of riders, badges glinting in the lantern light. Sheriff Langley, broad-shouldered, his coat soaked to the bone, dismounted with a grim nod. "Got word from town," he said, reloading his revolver. "Figured we'd best come early." "Early enough," James answered, lowering his weapon. From behind the barn, Marcus Blackwood emerged mud-splattered, eyes burning with the fury of a man who couldn't comprehend defeat. "You think you've won?" he snarled, voice breaking. "You ruined me, hollerin'." James stepped forward, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "You did that yourself, Marcus. You just needed someone else to blame." Blackwood's hand twitched toward his gun, but he never drew. One clean shot rang out, not from James, but from the sheriff behind him. The sound rolled across the valley, final as a church bell. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Blackwood lay face down in the mud. His torch smoldered beside him, its fire dying in the rain. Sarah sank to her knees, exhaustion washing over her like the flood that had just saved them. James dropped beside her, his good hand finding hers. "It's over," he said softly, and this time it was. Weeks later, peace came like a long, gentle exhale. Rain fell not as punishment, but as healing. Grass returned green and tender. Morning glories crept along the new fence posts, their violet blooms curling toward the sun, as if the earth itself remembered how to hope again. James, arm still in a sling, sat on the porch with Thomas, teaching the boy how to carve wood, a small cradle, smooth and simple. The shavings curled at their feet like tiny ribbons of light. Inside, Emma bent over her sums, the lantern glow painting her face in gold. The house hummed with the soft music of ordinary life, the kind of peace you only earn by surviving what tried to destroy you. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Sarah came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. James looked up, and for a long while they didn't speak. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full. Then James reached into his pocket. His hand trembled slightly as he placed something in her palm. William's wedding ring, dulled by years, but warm from his hand. "Not to replace," James said quietly, eyes on the horizon, "but to continue." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The ring was cool against her skin, and yet it burned with meaning. She looked at him. This man who had entered her life on a night of snow and blood, who had rebuilt her home, her faith, and the part of her heart she thought had died. "Yes," she whispered. The word hung between them, gentle as prayer. Their wedding took place beneath the great oak that had survived every storm. The neighbors came, faces weathered but smiling, hands rough from labor and kindness. The preacher spoke of second chances and the way love grows best in soil that has known sorrow. Emma carried wild flowers. Thomas fidgeted with his tie. When the vows were spoken, the crowd cheered, and sunlight broke through the clouds like a benediction. That evening, as the guests drifted home and the last lanterns dimmed, Sarah opened the family Bible. Her handwriting was slow, steady, shaped by years of work and weather. She wrote, "Love does not erase loss. It builds upon it. It grows like morning glories climbing from broken wood toward the sun." The ranch thrived. The fields bore fruit, the fences stood strong, and laughter filled the valley where gunfire once echoed. Travelers who passed along the road would pause to read the name carved into the wooden gate, Morning Glory Ranch. And when they asked about it, Sarah would smile, a soft, knowing smile touched by memory, and say, "Because love, like those flowers, opens anew each day." Sometimes life doesn't hand us miracles in lightning or thunder. It whispers them in the quiet after the storm. It's in the hands that choose to help, even when they're shaking, in the voices that stay soft, even when the world has been cruel, and in the hearts that keep opening again and again, no matter how many winters they've endured. Stories like this remind us that love doesn't erase what we've lost. It teaches us how to carry it differently, how to build something gentler, steadier, out of what once was broken. And maybe that's the truest kind of strength, the kind that grows in silence, watered by faith, and warmed by kindness. If this story touched something quiet in you tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Write your city, your town, wherever your heart calls home in the comments below. And if you'd like to walk with me through more stories like this, where hope still finds its way back, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, may your nights be calm, your mornings gentle, and may you always find a little light, even in the longest storm.